I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to updates from the war zone, we look at the new military aid package announced by the US for Kyiv, discuss the upcoming meeting between President Zelensky and Donald Trump, and review Russian rockets and the battle for space with a former commander of the International Space Station.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 27th of September, 2 years and 221 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and dialing in from the West Coast, Terry Virts, former US Air Force F-16 pilot, NASA astronaut, and currently a Senior Fellow at the National Centre for Energy Analytics. But first, I turn to Dom for the latest from the battlefield.
Well, hello, Francis. Hello, folks. Hello, Terry. Welcome back. F-16, International Space Station. It's no gazelle, is it, mate? Right, more details coming in on the US military support for Ukraine that we announced yesterday by President Biden. The details were coming through just as we were leaving the episode, but as well as the bits and pieces that we talked about yesterday, such as the 18 additional Ukrainian pilots starting F-16 training next year, although I question, could that change? I suppose it could very easily change with the election. The US is also going to donate a load of MRAPs, that's the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, armoured vehicle with a V-shaped hull, so if it goes over a mine, the blast is directed away from the crew compartment. It might lose a wheel, so it might not be able to move anywhere, but the crew generally are protected. Other light tactical vehicles, armoured bridging systems, for getting over rivers and things, a lot of small arms and ammunition, patrol boats, demolitions equipment and other munitions and bits and pieces. Quite a large package, as we described yesterday. President Biden said that the next Ramstein Group meeting, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, that meeting of the 50-plus nations that come together to pledge military support, that next one's going to be held at national leader level, which is unusual. It's usually just at either the defence ministers and or the chiefs of defence, so the military chiefs of defence. So to actually have it at presidential/prime ministerial level is unusual and good. These are all good, okay? These are all pushing it in the right direction. I wonder if, well, firstly, could it have all been done a bit sooner? I think the answer is probably yes. How much of it is vulnerable to Mr. Biden leaving office, and how much of it is the president trying to secure his legacy? I don't know. Answers on a postcard. I note, though, that in the statement that went with this announcement of military support, President Biden said, or just finished by saying, through these actions, my message is clear. The United States will provide Ukraine with the support it needs to win this war. I thought that was interesting. Now, of course, yes, he's leaving office, so it might be a bit easy just to fling the pie at the face of the next whoever it's going to be. But using words to win this war, we've spoken many, many times about what does the hackneyed old phrase for as long as it takes mean. I mean, you can't really back away from win this war. That's going to be interpreted by the commentariat and me and analysts and all the rest of it as a fairly maximalist endeavour. And you can't really row back from that. What you can do, though, is leave office. So I wonder if I'm making more of it than there really needs. I'll welcome your thoughts on that. Now, this wasn't the only package of military aid in support of Ukraine announced in the last couple of days. The German Ministry of Development announced an energy package worth about 70 million euros. That's nearly 80 million US dollars. Germany is going to provide heat and power plants, boiler systems, generators and solar power systems. Berlin also announced a 400 million euro, nearly $450 million increase in military funding for Ukraine to enable Ukraine, to buy additional air defence systems, tanks, drones, ammunition, spare parts, pretty much whatever they want. So they're the moves, they're the efforts here to directly gift military equipment. And then there's also the package of cash for humanitarian aid and energy. And there's also this other pot of money to allow Ukraine to go to the open market and go buy stuff. And I think this last lump of 400 million euros from Germany is in that third bucket there to allow Ukraine to go out to the open market. France got in on the act, although a little bit more Gallic, a little bit cooler about the whole thing. President Macron apparently told President Zelensky during a meeting on Wednesday that France will, so this is what he said, will train and fully equip a Ukrainian brigade in the near future. Okay, now I say define the type of brigade. It's a very different size and shape and requirement, an infantry brigade of lots of soldiers running around compared to armour, which is soldiers and tanks and all that kind of stuff. So define the type of brigade, define fully equip, define train. Is that individual training or the crew training if it's a vehicle, or combined arms training with other parts of the military? And finally, define the near future. Okay, but put ticks in all those boxes and I'll be a very happy little baguette, Monsieur Macron. We shall see. Now then, inside Ukraine, more drones fired by Russia at Ukraine last night. 24 out of 32 Shahed-type drones were shot down. Another was lost, which we take to mean brought down by electronic warfare. And one other entered Romanian airspace, according to Ukraine's Air Force. Now, if only Romania, or that funny defence alliance that it's part of, had some air defence capability to shoot down these things if they look like they may be heading out of Ukrainian airspace, it would be a good thing. Of course, in such a situation, you wouldn't want to wait until the projectile carrying high explosive actually flew into NATO airspace before it was brought down. It would be an act of self-defence by NATO to shoot these things down inside Ukraine if it looked like it was heading our way. And of course, the byproduct of any such unfortunate policy decision like that would be that NATO would be, in effect, providing air defence to the border regions of Ukraine. So, a lot to unpack there. But given what else we hear about all this nuclear escalation and God knows what else, people changing the rules, I don't see anything wrong with NATO saying in their own self-defence they need to put up an umbrella that may, unfortunately, extend inside Ukraine. The only way to get around that, Vladimir, if you're listening, stop firing your drones into Ukraine. There we go. Anyway, as it stands, civilians were killed yesterday in the town of Izmail in southern Odessa Oblast, also killed in Chasiv Yar, Siversk, Toretsk in Donetsk Oblast, and in Kherson too. Lots of injuries across the country. Meanwhile, the New York Times are reporting US intelligence agencies have cautioned that Russia may respond with increased force, potentially including lethal attacks on the US and allies if Ukraine is allowed to use long-range missiles supplied by the US, UK and France for deep strikes into Russian territory. Blah, 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 blah. So the self-deterrence is neatly keeping pace with the murder of civilians in Ukraine. Good stuff, policymakers. A couple more, Francis. Reporting from the think tank Institute for the Study of War says that Russian FSB, so the Federal Security Service, Russian FSB supposedly struggling to coordinate the combat tasks with the Russian military, despite having control over what they say is a counter-terrorism operation against the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. Now, this comes from Russian exiled opposition outlet Novaya Gazeta Europe. They were reporting on Wednesday that elements of the FSB Spetsnaz are fighting in Kursk Oblast. They're thought to be going after Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, as they put it, in the area. But they are ill-suited for combined arms battles using heavy equipment, tanks, artillery and so on, against regular military forces. Now, the ISW say that FSB Spetsnaz forces have typically conducted counter-terrorism ops against small terrorist groups and likely lack the training needed for a heavy metal punch-up. Well, I added that last bit of insightful analysis, not the ISW. But another source close to Russian special services reportedly told Novaya Gazeta Europe that the FSB Special Operations Center does not have a, quote, common connection with Russian military units, and that there is still no common headquarters for coordinating combat tasks between the FSB and the Russian military. Now, you may remember Putin tasked the FSB with taking charge of the so-called counter-terrorism operation in Belgorod, Bryansk and Kursk oblasts of Russia on August the 9th, following that Ukrainian incursion into Kursk 3 days earlier. ISW say that, well, as we've reported elsewhere, Putin then reassigned overlapping tasks to the military, to the FSB and to the Rosgvardia, which is basically the National Guard. We've said all along that lack of clarity over command and control will only add friction, complication. It will just stress an already very brittle system. You've got to get the command and control sorted out, who can do what and who can tell who to do what, basically, command and control. Without that, it could very easily fall apart. We thought that putting civilians, as in the FSB, in charge of a military operation, even if they dress it up as counter-terrorism, it was never going to work out well. And that seems to be the case. Now, there has been no change in the front lines in Kerch over the last few days. There's been an awful lot of fighting. Russia's MOD said yesterday that they had defended against a Ukrainian assault in the vicinity of Obukovka. That's about 20 km northwest of Suja. That's on the western edge of the main salient that Ukraine has managed to establish inside Russia. That suggests that Ukraine is still putting effort into trying to push west down that corridor into that chunk of land bounded by the border to the south and west and the river and the high ground to the north. It suggests that they're not transitioning onto the defensive and just trying to hold what they've got, but still continuing to try to push. No significant advances by either side elsewhere in Russia or Ukraine, including the Donbass. Now then, two more. Interesting story today in the Kyiv Independent. Go and have a look at them online. Russia is attempting to bolster defences around the Kerch bridge using underwater drone traps, they suggest. They're citing the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, which we've reported on before. They say work over the last month has seen metal structures put in place using barges and a floating crane. There's an unverified photo accompanying their report online, which shows a barge pulling what looks like a huge section of metal fencing, like a great big sort of waffle maker, basically. And the report comes a day after Ukraine's Navy spokesperson, Dmitry Pletenchuk, said Russian forces were building a new but unidentified structure near the Crimean bridge, the Kerch bridge. Just finally for me, Francis, just following up on yesterday's story that I finished with in Final Thoughts yesterday, actually, Qatar had brokered the return from Russia of 9 kidnapped Ukrainian children. It gets a bit complicated now. Ukraine's ombudsman, Dmitry Lubinets, said this morning that Kyiv did not conduct such an exchange. Mr. Lubinets said no deals were made between the two countries, and the reports are, quote, promoting Russian narratives. This report also comes from the Kyiv Independent. You can have a look there whilst looking at the bridge story. Now, Mr. Lubinets said that international humanitarian law does not provide for such a process as the exchange of children. It is all very confusing, Francis, but what is not in doubt is that over 19,500 children have been confirmed as abducted by Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion. Fewer than 400 have been returned home. This comes from the Ukrainian National Information Bureau, detailed on the Children of War database. We've got the link. We'll put it in the show notes for today. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for that. And I should just add on that issue of children. The 19,000 figure is way, way out of date. We've been citing that figure because we have no other for many, many months now. But given the rate in which children are being taken from Ukraine, particularly from the occupied territories, it is not in any way overestimating the figure if we say many, many more thousands have gone since then. And I expect there will be an update from the Ukrainian government at some stage. But I think, and I only have a sense here, I think that one of the reasons they are a little bit cautious about talking about this is they think that the more spotlights they perhaps raise on it, particularly geographically, it may lead to Moscow perhaps putting more attention in more children being taken out more quickly. That's just speculation on my part, but I think it might explain some of the reasons why there is so much caution around reporting of numbers and localities that these terrible, terrible incidents are taking place. But we will continue to monitor it as closely as we can. Now, Dom, you mentioned that piece in the New York Times. It's an interesting read, no huge revelations, but I did just want to quote it a little bit further. As you say, US intelligence agencies believe Russia is likely to retaliate, they say, with greater force. That's one of the briefings, no doubt, of many that Biden is receiving. And just to quote a little bit further from the piece, it says, the findings may help explain in part why the decision has been so difficult for Biden to make and show the internal pressures on him to say no to Mr. Zelensky's request. US officials who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations said it remained unclear what Mr. Biden would decide to do. That's important. Critics of Mr. Biden and his advisors say they would have been too easily intimidated by Putin's hostile rhetoric, and they say that the administration's incremental approach to arming the Ukrainians has disadvantaged them on the battlefield. Proponents of their approach say that it has largely been successful in averting a violent Russian response, though that may no longer be the case. British leaders, it goes on, have been less risk-averse. They have voiced support for allowing the Ukrainians to use the long-range missiles that they have supplied for strikes deep inside Russia. But they have been waiting for Mr. Biden to take a position on the matter before authorising strikes, since the potential Russian response could have implications for security for the coalition as a whole. So quite a neat summary there of the state of play. That all tallies with our own understanding of the dialogues and tensions within the Biden administration on this question. Clearly, though, no final decisions have been made. The difference on perspective on the war between the Democrats and the Republicans is becoming increasingly clear, though, with Kamala Harris saying yesterday some people in the US are forcing Ukraine to give up its territories to Russia. This sounds like Putin's statement. He is not offering peace. He is offering capitulation. This is dangerous and unacceptable. Biden, as you say, Dom, also put out that statement saying that we need to help Ukraine to win the war. It is noteworthy, that shift in tone, I agree. But how meaningful is it, as you say, in his final months as president? There is also no guarantee that he can make, realistically, whilst the spectre of a Trump presidency hovers over the discussions. And on that subject, today is the day that Trump says he will meet with Zelensky at Trump Tower in New York. We weren't sure it was going to take place, but it is. And in typical Trumpian fashion, the former president has revealed a personal plea Zelensky sent him before the meeting. Trump took the unusual step of posting the message to his Truth Social account with the apparent intention of making Zelensky look keen to meet him. That was a text passed to Trump by the Deputy Chief of Mission for Ukraine's US Embassy. I will read that message in full, given that it's been widely reported. So this is from President Zelensky to Donald Trump. Dear Donald, I hope you're doing well. I recall our recent phone call. It was really good. All of us in Ukraine want to end this war with a just peace. And we know that without America, this is impossible to achieve. That's why we have to strive to understand each other and remain in close contact. Days ago, we requested a meeting with you, and I really want to hear your thoughts directly and firsthand. You know, I always speak with great respect about everything connected to you, and that's how it should be. I can be in New York on Friday, which would be a good time to meet. I believe it's important for us to have a personal contact and to understand each other 100%. Let me know if you are in the city at that time. I would really like for our meeting to take place as part of our efforts to help us end this war in a just way. Sincerely, Vladimir. Quite extraordinary to see that, and it just gives you an insight there of, despite how often we think that communications between world leaders is always conducted through very formal statements, correspondence over the phone, through official, headed diplomatic communiques, quite often it's texts, it's WhatsApp, that aren't too dissimilar than if you were trying to arrange a meeting with a family friend or something else. It is quite extraordinary to see it in those terms. And we know, as has been talked about many times, that the key communications that were taking place between former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Zelensky in the first weeks of the war were quite often done over text message. And so a rare example of that there. But despite that meeting taking place today, Trump's rhetoric has become noticeably more critical, I think, of the Ukrainians in recent weeks. In a speech in Mint Hill, North Carolina on Wednesday, Trump said that Zelensky refuses to make a deal with President Putin and that the country has been demolished because of his refusal to negotiate. Trump added, the president of Ukraine is in our country and he's making little nasty aspersions towards your favourite president. Me. Now, I'm guessing that is a reference to the critical remarks in the New Yorker that we discussed, and it's clear in the text message that Zelensky sent that he is trying to placate Trump as to regards to that criticism. Now, during the same speech, Trump said any deal, the worst deal, would have been better than what we have now, adding that the people are dead and the country is in rubble. The previous day at a rally in Georgia, Trump said every time Zelensky comes to the United States, he walks away with $100 billion. I think he's the greatest salesman on earth, but we're stuck in that war unless I'm president. Now, read into those remarks what you will. I think they're in very poor taste, personally. But no wonder the Ukrainians feel they need to prepare for the worst when you hear that. And just a final word before we turn to Terry on the United Nations briefly. Relevant meetings are still rumbling on, with Brazil still talking about its peace plan proposal put forward with China, the one that's been very strongly dismissed by the Ukrainians. And just on the subject of China, we learned that in part, I would assume due to the backdoor discussions in New York and elsewhere, that China and India will be able to, they say, reduce differences and build some consensus on disengaging troops from friction points to end the standoff in Eastern Ladakh and agree to maintain dialogue to reach a resolution that both sides can find agreeable at an early date. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the nuances on that issue. This is basically those border tensions, right? And that has been a major concern for India. Some people have said that that's a reason why they've been hesitant to go in fully in more closely aligning economically with China. But perhaps this is an indication that things are defrosting. If so, that is worthy of note in the context of this Cold War II, if we want to articulate it as such. But it could also just be a very, very small step that discussions are ongoing and not really indicative of any major change. But still, thought it was worthy of note. So that's where we are in the political and military realm. Now, I'm delighted to bring in Terry Virts, who will be discussing some of these themes in more detail. Terry, thank you so much for your time. There's so much we can cover, but let's jump into reflecting on a particular subject of interest to you, given your distinguished history. The Russian space program. It's been a long time since we've had you on, many months now. What's caught your eye on that question since we last spoke to you?
Thanks, Francis, and thanks for having me on. I just want to start off real quick with condolences for David Nicholls. What a great young man. His passing made me think the clock is ticking and we're not going to be here forever. So if there's something you want to do, if there's something you need to say, it's time to do it because tomorrow's not guaranteed. So we all miss David. But to jump into the space question, what's been going on really since the beginning of the full-scale invasion is life is normal. NASA's been flying astronauts on the Soyuz, launching out of Kazakhstan. Russian cosmonauts are flying on SpaceX. One is launching here in just a few days, and maybe next week. And that has a really stark implication. If you say it out loud, there's a large contingent of NASA people in Moscow, in Russia, which is a combat zone. You know, Ukraine bombs them periodically. I saw a map recently of the surface-to-air missile, the air defense system around Moscow. There are a lot, in theory, of missiles ready to shoot down drones while they're flying their commercial airliner into this combat zone. It's just striking to see that. Also, while they're taking Evan Gershkovich and other Americans. And so it's just amazing that this is happening. To me, it feels like doing an Arctic expedition with German scientists in 1942. I mean, you just wouldn't imagine that. Another thing, and knock on wood, and most importantly, the Russians have been flying safely, and I certainly hope and expect that that will continue. But it's been a bit of a mess. I mean, the Russian segment on the International Space Station has some pretty serious cracks. They literally have to keep the hatch shut because the air leaks out, and then every once in a while they open up the hatch, go do their work, and close the hatch again on that segment. They've had some serious cooling leaks on two Soyuz that made the spaceship basically unusable while they were in space. Someone drilled a hole in a Soyuz. One crashed. This has been a few years, and the crew was able to abort, and they were safe. That's been a few years ago. But when you think of the civilian space industry, of course they're affected by sanctions and mobilization. I mean, if you're a 28-year-old man working in the space industry, you may be in Georgia now or Turkey because you don't want to go to the front line. The equipment that they need is harder to get than it used to be. We just saw this feared, mighty Satan, the RS-28 Sarmat, their nuclear missile just exploded and left a giant hole like a sand trap in a golf course. I think they've blown that thing up 4 times. And although it's a nuclear missile, it's still part of their space program. The old Dmitry Rogozin, the old head, used to brag about how their space program helps their nuclear missiles. So there's been issues there for sure. I mean, it's a nation at war. And I just think we need to say it out loud and be aware of that.
Thank you. So when you hear some of these big bombastic rhetoric remarks from Putin around new rockets, whether it be Satan or whether it be hypersonic that they're developing that are even more advanced than the ones they claim to have now, do you, as an expert on this, just think this is, ridiculous, where the rest of the world starts tensing up a little bit? I'm just interested in your general perspective as somebody who looks at this so closely. How much do you take seriously of what comes out of the Kremlin?
Well, it's funny. We just heard the quote that Zelensky is the biggest salesman. I think Putin is the biggest salesman. He's been able to completely paralyze the West with his threats of doom and gloom. Does Russia have intercontinental ballistic missiles? Of course. Will they all work? Of course not. It's Russia. A lot of stuff's not going to work. But you don't need them all to work when you're talking about nukes. You just need a few. And I have no doubt that they have enough that could work that, yes. But this new deadly missile, we've had intercontinental missiles for over 50 years. They make it sound great. This is the great sales job by Putin. It's just another ICBM. Do they have the Kinzhal hypersonic missile? Yes. Can we shoot them down with Patriots? According to what I've heard on the Telegraph, yes, you can. So these are weapons. They kill people. The conventional weapons are killing Ukrainians every day. We need to take them seriously. But there's a lot of hype and bombast. And Mr. Putin probably went to Trump University. He's very good at his sales pitch.
Well, thanks for that, Terry. And I know that Dom, when he comes in shortly, will be wanting to ask a little bit more about some of the questions around rockets and the space combat situation at the moment, because, of course, he was at the interesting briefing here of UK Space Command. But just moving forward a little bit first, of course, in the 1960s, we had Kennedy's vision and it very much being vital when reflecting on the information wars, the symbolic nature of what was going on during the Cold War period between the Soviet Union and the United States and the so-called free world. That has not happened in the same way around technology, around space, and all of these other things that are going on at the moment in this context of the Ukraine war. So when you look at what's been happening in the last few months, years now, would you say that that's a mistake on the part of the United States? What would you want President Biden to be doing if you were advising him in the White House?
Many things. And it's funny that you say it's a mistake. I think it may be the mistake, to be honest. And I've been thinking about this yesterday. It struck me. There's some lessons from the space program that I think can be applied to Ukraine. I do some guest lecturing at Harvard Business School and other places. And one of the courses I teach is why organizations fail. And it's about the Columbia and Challenger space shuttle accidents that we had. And the first big lesson I think that you can take from the space program, as you just mentioned, is the idea of vision. During the 60s, President Kennedy gave a speech. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade and returning him safely to the Earth. And I think that's the best vision in the history of visions. We knew exactly what we were going to do, and we had a time frame to do it in. And that's been wholly lacking, like you said. And although apparently, per your reporting today, President Biden did say that they want to win. So that's great. It's better than as long as it takes, which is not a vision. But not only did we have the vision, and I think the vision in Ukraine, if it was me, it would be kick the Russians out of Ukrainian territory, have accountability and justice for the war criminals, and also reparations. The U.S. and Europe are going to end up paying hundreds of billions of dollars. I think that Russia should pay that also. Without all three of those elements, it's not a just peace. But words without action is just hallucination, as they say. And so there's a lot of visions out there. But in NASA, we had a strategy. We had the Mercury program, and then Gemini, and then Apollo, and that's how we landed on the moon. So you need to come up with an actual strategy to do that. It sounds like President Zelensky's done that. It sounds like he's pitching it to President Biden, and he's going to talk to Trump today, which is great. But you need a vision and you need strategy. That has been lacking. Hopefully we can come to a point where we get that. And the other space program parallel that I just have been noodling around in my brain, the course I teach about Columbia and Challenger, we could talk for hours about this, but the bottom line, there were engineers who were speaking up, who were saying, hey, in Challenger, the O-rings are a problem. NASA had videos of O-rings causing problems. In Columbia, there were people that said, hey, this foam is a problem. We had video of the foam. I saw video of the foam before the accident. And that was being communicated to leaders, and the leaders ignored them. And then we ended up with both space shuttles crashing. Today, there are a countless number of people, many of the best on your podcast. We had Elliot Cohen and Phillips O'Brien yesterday. General Ben Hodges has been on. Adam Kinzinger has been on. Many, like Eastern Europeans especially, seem to really have a clear-eyed view of what's happening. Lots of people are standing up and yelling about the foam and the O-rings, and nobody's listening. And it feels like that. So I think that's an important parallel to talk about.
That's really interesting, Terry. Now, just one final question on this, which is looking ahead much more to the future, the decade, the century, which is that there's a lot of talk about the increasing importance of space war, as it were, technology, the use of satellites, the use of new technology able to destroy satellites. I just wonder, when you look ahead to the decades of potential increased conflict between whether it be America, the West, China, what worries you the most? If the red lights are flashing on the space shuttle dashboard, what alarms you about what could be coming down the road?
Yeah, well, probably the biggest problem in space would be space debris from satellites exploding. But the consequences of that on Earth, I think, are much worse. The consequences of losing this war are absolutely terrible. And the biggest one, and this has been coming out in recent weeks, but basically what this war has shown the world is that you need to get nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation is a thing again. Ukraine agreed to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and now look where they are. So all the other nations of the world have learned this loud and clear. Countries are going to want to develop nuclear weapons, and they're never going to want to get rid of them. Allowing Russia to win in Ukraine would encourage China and other dictatorships. It would be the end of Pax Americana. Russia would keep trillions of dollars worth of energy. And I wrote an op-ed as part of my energy think tank job. There's a lot of really bad consequences. But we never talk about the consequences of victory. And the consequences of victory are really good. China would be contained. This would be the end of Putinism. This rules-based world that we created in the post-war World War II environment would survive. And that's a good thing. So we need to think of that too. And the other thing, we just had a quote from Mr. Trump today. He had a rant the other day where he was talking about, it was your favorite subject. He was talking about how, well, Russia wins wars. That's what Russia does. They beat Napoleon. That's insane, because it got cold in the winter of 1812 does not mean we shouldn't support Ukraine. That's an absolutely insane argument. And today he said, any deal is better than this. And at the Air Force Academy, they torture you as a freshman and they make you memorize 1 million quotes. And one of the quotes that I've never forgotten is by a guy named John Stuart Mill. And he says, war is an ugly thing, but it's not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks that nothing worth war is worse. And that's really true today. And that kind of summarizes us in the West. Yeah, the war is terrible, but the consequences of losing that war are much worse. And I wish that all of our leaders had that perspective.
Well, thanks, Terry. That's really interesting. And of course, Russia loses many wars. It lost the Russo-Japanese War, it lost the Soviet-Afghan War. You could argue it lost the Cold War, even though it's not the same kind of war. You could say that it lost it. So it's just an ahistorical argument. But then I don't think Trump is particularly spending his time reading military history books over the weekend. His loss is what I say. But Terry, just before I bring in Dom here, I just wanted to very briefly ask you about your recent trip to Ukraine. Now, for those listeners who will be familiar with your trip, I've made reference to it on the podcast before. Terry was listening to the podcast, which is always greatly appreciated, and heard the episode that I did with Ukraine Focus, the ambulance delivery charity that was travelling from D-Day to Ukraine to deliver ambulances. And Terry heard that episode. And what happened next, Terry? Why don't you fill in the blanks?
Sure. So I heard a story last week, actually. There was a GI, World War II, he's 18, 19-year-old kid, a Jewish guy, and he got captured by the Nazis. So he was very scared. No one wants to get captured by the Nazis, but if you're Jewish, that's especially bad. And so they put him to work in the fields. He was farming. And so he was getting these potatoes and he would poke holes in them. And the hope was that the potatoes would rot because they had holes in them. So there was this 19-year-old kid, and he wasn't Eisenhower. He couldn't command the 8th Air Force to go bomb Berlin, but he could try and make the potatoes rot. It was like the one thing he could do to try and help win the war. And for me, Yeah, I've been very frustrated. I'm not the national security advisor. I'm not the secretary of state. I'm not the president. I wish I were, but I'm not. So the ambulance mission with Ukraine Focus was like one tangible thing that I could actually do to help people. So I did one mission earlier this year. We drove a group of 10 ambulances from France. The man who started this organization, Brock Bierman, he was a deputy administrator of USAID, which is a big $40 billion U.S. government agency. And when he left government, he started this NGO, and he's delivered over 200 ambulances. The Ukrainian doctors say that each one saves 250 lives. It's a need that they have. Unfortunately, the Russian drone operators target them directly because they know, if you blow up a pickup truck, you blow up a pickup truck. But if you blow up an ambulance, not only do you kill those people, but you kill all the people that they could have saved. So when we were there, you reported it earlier, probably in the summer. There was a 35-year-old Ukrainian lady, a medic, that was killed because of FPV, because a Russian kid flew his drone into an ambulance intentionally and killed her. So the ambulance that we delivered actually went to that organization, and we handed it off to the commander of that woman who had just been killed. So that was pretty powerful. The big thing about Ukraine Focus is it's a volunteer organization. All the drivers, they have to pay their own way, and you have to pay for part of your ambulance. So you have to be all in, and there's just a constant need. So we just got this big batch of used ambulances from Hungary, and we're raising money right now. I think Brock told me we've got $100,000 US raised, and we need another 50,000 to finish buying this batch. So there is a need for that. And I just heard this morning we're doing mission patches. So just like on NASA, you get a mission patch for every space flight you do. Now each batch of ambulances we deliver, they're making cool NASA mission patches. And he told me if anybody donates $100, we'll send them a mission patch. So their website is just ukrainefocus.org. And it's a great organization, really super cool people. Having a chance to go to Ukraine, that was my first time to go into Ukraine. And I could talk about it forever, Francis, but Ukraine is it's a country. It's like going to a European country. There's people walking around, there's moms pushing babies in carts, and there's old men and women walking through the park. It's just a normal country. In Russia, get out. We don't want you there. Just get out. It's not normal that you're there. But I really did I love my time in Ukraine. It was brief, too brief. I'll be going back, but it's a great organization, ukrainefocus.org.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. And for those who are interested, we'll have a link in the show notes to that and to the episode that I recorded with Ukraine Focus back in June. But Dom, let's bring you in here. I know you've got lots of thoughts on Space Command. You've been reading your Patrick Moore books and just generally trying to become an expert on this in the last 48 hours. So where do you want to start, with space or with something else?
I'll start off with space, thanks, Francis. Don't need to do any pre-reading. I grew up with 2000 AD, so I know everything there is to know about space. But Terry, great to have you back. Lovely to chat to you. I was at the space conference earlier this week. I interviewed Major General Paul Tedman, who's the head of UK Space Command. I was interested in the militarization of space. You can't really get much of an answer out of these guys. They just don't really give much away. So I'll be interested in your thoughts, Terry, and Russia in a moment, but China, first of all. General Tedman told me that 70% of China's space architecture is less than 4 years old. Now, obviously, that doesn't all have a military application, but some will. And there's dual use stuff, imagery, I would have thought in particular. But do you worry, Terry, that let's cut to the quick, the US is being outpaced by China in particular in space?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, that China is definitely the 21st century threat. Russia, in general, as a nation, is on the decline. This war is just accelerating their decline. And China has been the opposite. They have a massive economy, and they have a lot of smart engineers who are doing amazing things. They landed a rover on the far side of the moon. They have their own space station. The Chinese space program is growing. It is not benign. They do have scientists doing fun experiments in space, but they have a huge military presence. I know that is front and center at the U.S. Space Force. We're just very focused on them. And they're still, of course, well behind where we are, but nothing is guaranteed. And that's definitely a focus on the U.S. side also.
Interesting you mentioned about China's landing a rover on the far side of the moon. There is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is the last time the international community ever tried to put any sort of legal framework on the operation in space. So it's massively out of date, written at the height of the Cold War and just hopelessly out of date. But at the same time, we are now learning quite how much of the moon is made up of metal oxides, other rare earth metals, silicon, titanium, all that kind of lots of exciting things. Now, I'm concerned. There was a question at the space conference, question asked to Paul Bate, who's the head of the UK Space Agency, the kind of civilian side of the space sector over here. And he said the rewards of space will fall to those who act now. How concerned should we be that countries that can get to the moon, and I know this is a big if, but if they can dig and extract these precious metals, they're going to have a huge impact in the next technological revolution with smart and quantum technology here on Earth. So should we be concerned that China's landing on the far side of the moon, India's up there now, there's no law governing who can do what to the moon and so on and so forth? Is someone going to steal a march on the tech revolution of the 21st century, do you think?
It's interesting. Space law is actually a field. If you're a lawyer, you could be a space lawyer, which is kind of cool. I think that you can expect that China will act like China. You can see what they're doing in the ramming Philippine Coast Guard ships and taking over Africa for their resources. And China is going to continue to be China. That as long as, I hate to say China, it's the Chinese Communist Party that is going to behave as the Chinese Communist Party does, as long as they're in power, which may not be forever, but they are for now. And for now, the resources in space are interesting. There's probably a lot. I've worked with some companies that are trying to map those resources, but it hasn't come to bear yet. We're not mining lithium on the moon to ship it back to Earth, in large part just because the cost of launch and the dollars per kilogram is so high. But that may not be the case. And the point of the quote that you had earlier, the first movers are going to have a big advantage, the people who get there first. So I would expect that China will behave like China does. If they find something of value, they're going to take it. So you just need to expect that they've shown us who they are, so they're going to continue to behave that way.
Thanks. Now, a bit closer to Ukrainian home, I was talking to him about Russia, and he said, this is General Tedman, the head of UK Space Command, he said that Russia's war on Ukraine hadn't drained Russia's space capabilities, but he did say that the architecture they've got, all the kit, not only the spacecraft, but also the ground stations and the fairly creaky data links and all that kind of stuff. He said it was reasonably old architecture. So what do you think? You alluded to it a little bit earlier on. Longer do you think it will be before Russia's space program degrades without investment that's needed, and that investment that's impacted by sanctions? And even if it's not impacted, it's going to cost a huge amount. So how much longer do you think Russia can ignore the problem of its creaking space architecture?
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's been degrading for years now. There's just not any innovation or new things happening in the Russian space program. And there really hasn't been since the 60s and 70s. They've just been building the same thing over and over. We used to joke, but it wasn't really a joke. And like the Soyuz, there were all of these different instruments. And there was a guy who designed and built them, Yuri, from the 1970s. And like those guys, Yuris they're getting old and dying and retiring. And when they're gone, there is no guy to replace them. So the aging workforce that they have, the fact that millions of young Russians, especially the educated ones, like the peasants, the Asian Russians in the Siberia, they're around, they can be sent to the front line. But the educated engineers and stuff, those guys are all in Turkey right now, living their best life. And so, like I said earlier, there's just a serious problem. And what had been a continual slow burn, gradual decline in the Russian space program is just being accelerated. Like many problems in Russian society that are being accelerated by this genocidal war that Putin's prosecuting, the decline in their space program is going to get worse.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. A couple more, if I may. I was talking about space weapons. And General Tedman said that China has, and I'm sure others have, the ability to grapple spacecraft. So they got spacecraft with the physical ability to collect debris, to collect space debris. That's your sort of left of arc, or to go and smash up another satellite. That's your right of arc, depending on quite how jaundiced you're feeling. But I don't know if we'd ever be able to physically see these things moving towards you and trying to grab you. But when I was talking about offensive capabilities, and I asked, what have we got? If it's a realm of defence, the clue's in the title, defence, but it wasn't that long ago that we had the War Office here until they turned all pink and fluffy and called it the Ministry of Defence. But if it's a defensive domain now, space, then that has an offensive side to it as well as defensive. So I asked him about what offensive capability we have in space. And he said, I won't answer that. Ambiguity is sometimes useful. Now, it might be that the UK head of Space Command reaches for ambiguity because we, the Brits, haven't got an awful lot. I don't know. But what do you think? What do you think that the offensive space capability is from allies?
Well, I haven't been in Space Command for almost a decade. And when I was there, my job was to fly the space station. So I wasn't doing the cool stuff. But you could imagine it's possible to rendezvous with another satellite. We've been doing that since Gemini in the 60s. So satellites can go up. If I were thinking about it, you might put a camera on a satellite and see what's happening. I was in charge of robotics when I was at NASA. So we have robotic arms that can grab things. One of the things that's really important for NASA's moon program is refueling in space. And I think Northrop Grumman has a project. Several American companies are doing in-space refueling, which is good. If your satellite's out of gas and you got to fill it up. So there's, like you said, there's positive things you can do. It's not that hard to imagine you might do something nefarious. I will say, though, those are all benign, but there's kinetic things you can do. You can blow satellites up. And we've been doing that since the 80s. The Chinese did a really famous anti-satellite test in 2007, created a huge cloud of debris when I was commander of the space station in 2015. So 8 years later, we had to maneuver to avoid that debris. The Indians decided they wanted to join the club, so they showed the world that they could blow up a satellite in 2019, which was an absolutely horrendous, terrible idea. And then the Russians, for whatever, who knows, they decided to blow up a satellite just a few months before the war 2 years ago. And that cloud of debris went right at the space station. The astronaut, including the Russian cosmonauts, they had to jump in their Soyuz and close the hatch. We call it shelter in place, because they didn't know if this debris was going to hit the ISS. So the biggest threat, I think the biggest threat to humanity that nobody's talking about is space debris. Because if we created just a giant, massive cloud of debris, and that's unlikely, and hopefully that won't happen. But if we did have it, if we had a shooting war in space, losing space would be very significant. It would impact the developed world's lives, even of civilians.
Yeah, I mean, that came out loud and clear from the space conference, that the statistic was that every person in the Western world uses 40 satellites a day, whether they know it or not. Interesting stat, quite how you pass that, I'm not entirely sure. And the amount of debris and activity, not just debris, but activity in low Earth orbit, that's where the majority of items are. He said there was 1 million items of a size of a penny or a cent and bigger, 40,000 items bigger than a cricket ball or a baseball. So there's a lot of stuff in low Earth orbit. It's congested. It is a tight space, and we've seen what happens there on Earth. Look at the Suez Canal, look at the Strait of Hormuz. There are malign actors who use these choke points for their own ends on Earth, so no reason why we shouldn't expect that to happen in the choke point in space, which at the moment is low Earth orbit. I'm rambling now, as if I know what I'm talking about. I don't really, so I'll call a halt there, but interested on your views on any of that, Terry. Final question from me. Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore went up to space with SpaceX in June. And they were only supposed to be there for a couple of months. Then the problem that they've had with the spacecraft mean they're not coming back till February next year. So question to you as an astronaut, how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare the mental space that your mission in space might suddenly be extended for months longer than you're expecting? And what message, if Sunita and Barry are listening, what message would you have to this pair up there remaining in space for months longer than they're expecting?
Yeah, I've been talking about that a lot on in different networks. It actually, when I was in space, we ended up getting stuck for a month longer, which was pretty significant, but it wasn't that bad. I used my philosophy, and I guess this is what I would say is, man, this is like bonus time in space. You'll have the rest of your life back down here on Earth, so just enjoy it, make the most of it. They did go, actually, originally it was only supposed to be an 8-day mission. So they went from 8 days to 8 months. So if you get stuck at the airport, it sucks. You can badmouth United Airlines or British Airways, whatever. And then you're on your way the next day or two. But imagine if you got stuck in the airport and then you had to move to the country where you were and get a house and move in. That's kind of what happened to them. But they're fine. They've done this before. It's bonus time in space. The problem always falls on the families. So they're the ones that are really suffering. Like the kids miss dad. They had summer plans. Now they don't. Now they won't even have Christmas together. So the stress and the problems always fall to the family. That's just the way it works in the space business and also in the military business, as you know.
Well, thanks very much, Terry. Just one question from me before we go to our final thoughts. And I was just quite struck by something you were saying there, talking about the Cold War and rockets being the symbol of one's country's power, in essence. And of course, what we tend to forget is we're still talking in the same language now about who's got the bigger rocket, has it got a pointy bit at the end, all of that sort of stuff. It still matters, and that's why Putin, of course, talks about it. But we're in a different era now. It's not about rockets. In the 20th century, who had the best rocket might have civilizational implications. That battle really, really mattered. But it's about AI. It's about other developmental technologies that are the priority. And I remember somebody making a very good point, which is they saw a photograph of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he was wearing a T-shirt, which I think had some sort of American branding on, or whether he was aware of this or not, and he was wearing an Apple Watch. And somebody said, this is a sign, whether they realise it or not, of just how backward Russia has become now. They are not at the forefront of technological innovation. Nobody's talking about them in terms of their AI work. They're talking about past battles where they were more successful, i.e. the space race. And if you want a symbol of that, it's the fact that they're wearing American fashion and American technology. And so my question is, when you look at AI and you look at the implications of AI and the battle perhaps between China, between America, between Britain and the other powers who are developing that, how significant do you think that will be for the space race 2.0? And also, connected to that, are we going to make Mars before 2040? So 2 connected questions there. Thanks.
So that's a great question. I think AI is super important. Your point of lack of Russian innovation is very poignant. But when I was there, I was struck by the cult of World War II and the cult of Yuri Gagarin. It's like they helped win World War II. They started off on the side of the Nazis for several years, and then they switched to our team, and then they helped win it for sure. And they launched the first human being in space. That was amazing. But time has gone on. Other things have happened, and yet it's still a cult in Russia. And that lack of innovation is there. And AI is a huge part of that. I worked with a group of AI folks here in the States. I'm actually working on a TV show this week, and I had a long discussion yesterday about what AI can do. The AI battle, it really is between the U.S. and China. That's where the innovation's happening. China has a massive effort in this phase. And it's kind of cool. You can make funny pictures of Vladimir Putin and whatever, but it can do a lot more than that. And it's the other things it can do that are really concerning. And so we need to find the balance between allowing companies to develop AI, let American tech companies do what American tech companies do best, while also being mindful, like, let's not destroy civilization along the way. Let's not have a Terminator 2 scenario with AI. So that is a tough balance for policymakers. The types of policymakers we have in the U.S. government are not always the most thoughtful engineers and scientists. So it's a struggle. Also, AI is something that really requires the U.S., Europe, China, everybody, the whole world to make some fundamental agreements. Personally, I think there should be an international treaty that doesn't allow robots to kill people without a human being in the loop. Like, the human should have to push the red button before some automated weapon kills people. I think that should be a treaty. But it's hard to imagine any treaty like that happening in today's world. Back to your Mars question. So in 1969, we had our Germans and the Soviets had their Germans that they captured after World War II. And we had Wernher von Braun, and he had a plan to be at Mars in 1989, in 20 years. And then in 1989, when George H.W. Bush came on, the first thing he did was set up a space exploration initiative. We were going to be on Mars in 20 years by 2009. Of course, all these programs, they come in over budget, they get canceled immediately. So we've been 20 years from Mars for the last 50 years. So I am not going to hold my breath, but we'll see.
That brings us now to the end of the episode and our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, do you want to start?
Thanks, Francis, and thanks, Terry, for everything there. Great to chat again. Folks, end of the week, end of another week, another tough week here. Saying goodbye to David. Thank you for your continued support. We've had loads of cards. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of cards today. Colleen, thank you very much for my card. I've distributed the others around the team that are here. We'll hold on to the ones for those that aren't, and David's parents. And I will try meditating again, Colleen. I'll give that another whirl. We've had Marmite from New Zealand. I didn't know you had Marmite in New Zealand. I thought it was just Vegemite. I thought you guys had just had Vegemite all the time. You were mad for it. You wrote a song about it, or at least put a line in a song. Anyway, Marmite from New Zealand, an anonymous card. I don't know if you meant to be anonymous, but thank you so much for sending us the Marmite from New Zealand, because you're quite right, Marmite sender. We've got so many flowers that you said we probably wouldn't want any more flowers, so send us some Marmite instead. Doesn't smell quite as good, but we'll pass that on to David's parents. But folks, it's lovely. It's really lovely. I mean, it's terrible. It's all the rest of it. You know, we know that. We're not going to dwell on it too much. But just to tip my hat to you again at the end of another week. Thank you. Thanks, guys. We'll have more details next week about David's funeral. We are going to be live streaming it, but we'll have times and dates and what have you in due course. A few bits and pieces we've got to sort out. But thank you for your continued support, and we send you our fond regards and our love as well, just as you're sending us all these wonderful things and your thoughts. So thanks, folks. We're thinking of you as you say you're thinking of us here. Thank you. I hope you have a good weekend.
Thanks, Dom. And I just want to echo that. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Sarah, to everybody who sent cards and gifts this week. It's been hugely, hugely appreciated. Terry, as ever, you're our guest. You've got the final thoughts for today and for the week.
Thanks, Francis, and thanks, Dom. Two quick thoughts. I'm reading a book by Eric Larson. It's called The Splendid and the Vile. Speaking of reading military history, Francis, it's about Churchill. It's about London in 1940, the bombing, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz. It is just shocking to me how many parallels there are between now and World War II. And I've known that since the beginning. For years, I've been saying it feels like it's 1938 and 1941 is not too far away. But the number of parallels between what was happening in England in 1940, England was isolated. You guys were alone. France had fallen. Churchill was begging Roosevelt for weapons. And Roosevelt finally eventually gave him 50 old used destroyers that were not really good in exchange for access to British military bases. It was just the same exact thing. Zelensky having to go around begging for equipment, while Londoners were being killed. I mean, bombs were landing in people's houses every day for 1940 into 1941. The presidential race in 1940 was really a presidential race, not only about the Depression, but largely about the war in Europe. Wendell Willkie, the Republican, ran as an anti-war candidate. He ran this one ad that said, "Hey, moms, if your boys are dying in Europe, it's your fault for voting for FDR." He was that. If you support the war in Europe, your kids are going to die. Ironically, had we supported with enough stuff before the war, we could have prevented it. And our boys did end up dying in Europe. And so the number of parallels between World War II and today are just striking. I wish that our Western leaders would wake up into the same level of wisdom that the Eastern European leaders have woken up to. And along those same lines, I've been thinking about this a lot. And I remember as a kid, I learned about manifest destiny. It was this idea that somehow God had ordained that America would rule the Western Hemisphere. England and the French and you guys could fight out the other hemisphere, but it was our destiny that we would have our nation. But that's not true at all. There is no manifest destiny. It's not preordained that we're going to win. We did win World War II barely, because we barely made the right decisions in time, and Hitler was kind of an idiot when it came to strategy. But that's not guaranteed in the future. And the fact that we won World War II doesn't mean that we're going to win in the future. And we really need to just wake up out of this slumber that we seem to have been in for years and become the arsenal of democracy that we haven't done. And I guess my final thought along both of those lines is that I believe if Ukraine wins, this is the last battle of World War III. And if Ukraine loses, it's the first battle of World War III.
Well, thank you very much, Terry, for your thoughts today. Always fascinating to hear from you on the subjects that we've discussed. Thank you, Dom, for joining us as well. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Roland and all of the others who've been on as well from The Telegraph, and our guests, of course. As Terry mentioned earlier, a really interesting episode yesterday with Professors Elliot Cohen and Phillips O'Brien, two very senior commentators on the war, very experienced. Highly recommend that episode, going into lots of granular detail about the strategic and analytical errors that have been made in the war so far and how that is rectified moving forward because of the risks that Terry just talked about there with regard to a future conflict. You've got to learn them now because otherwise it may well be too late tomorrow. But thank you all very much, and we will be back same time, same place, 1 o'clock London time on Monday. From London, all the very best for your weekend, and we'll see you next week. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.